Hello and welcome to my channel. This is a drawing of an American buffalo. It was done in colored pencil on toned paper. The paper was previously primed with some clear gesso. I'm going to show you how I did it. Let's have a look. So I've done a number of drawings on clear gesso. Clear gesso is a primer that creates a sanded surface, a textured surface that makes it easier to work with colored pencils and pastel pencils because you can layer more and the colors are more vibrant, and it's also easier to blend. Now, most of the drawings I've done on this surface so far were maybe a little bit less detailed or required a bit less precision. So I wanted to test this surface by drawing a slightly more detailed subject where I would be forced to work more from dark to light, and this is exactly going to be the case with this bison's fur. And I'm going to see how it goes. So I'm doing the sketch now. And let me say a few more words about the paper and the pencils. The pencils are Faber-Castell Polychromos, and the paper is the Fabriano toned paper, sand-colored paper, but like I said, I covered it with a bit of clear gesso. The clear gesso I used here was Winsor and Newton clear gesso. Now here on the background I used some ochre and reddish tones to see if I can make the background a bit more interesting, but I didn't really want to draw any specific shapes in the background. I just want to change the tones a little bit because I want to achieve kind of a yellowish, maybe slightly brownish and ochre tones to make it look like a prairie. And then I blended that gently with my finger, because you can do this on the surface. It blends quite easily. It's easier to move that pigment around because, you know, when you have a rough surface like this, it grinds on the pencil and it creates a bit more residue. Anyway, I'm moving on to the main subject, and I'm going to start with a black colored pencil because for some of the darker parts of the fur and the darker parts of the animal, I'm going to need much darker values. So I'm going to use a combination of a couple of dark pencils, a black, a dark sepia, which is kind of like a really dark brown, and of course a brown. It's going to be a walnut brown, I think. Anyway, I'm going to use the walnut brown for the most part, but I'm also going to use a bit of black for some of the darkest areas. Now, of course, the nostrils here are very dark. These are some of the darkest details on the animal's head, so naturally I used a black colored pencil there, and that made a transition towards these lighter areas with a brown colored pencil and a touch of raw umber and a bit of cinnamon around the nostrils, because I think some of the hair also has like a yellowish or rather a pinkish component to it. This part of the skin around the nostrils is a lot lighter, so I'm going to go in with some even lighter pencils, like an ivory colored pencil and a bit of a light beige red. But most of the work here is going to be done on the fur, and most of the work is going to be done with a brown colored pencil. So I'm going to show you how I plan to approach that, but first I'm drawing some of these more interesting details, because that's one of the things I like to do when I draw wildlife, but not just wildlife, but portraits of people as well. It's always a little bit more interesting to focus on details like the eyes, the mouth, the nose. So when I can skip ahead a little bit, I like to do that. So here I started with the eye, worked around it a little bit because we also have a little bit of that lighter skin, and then I put in some lighter value here at the top middle of the eyeball for the catch light. And yes, I can work from dark to light a little bit, but when I want something to be really bright, I just prefer to put in the light color first. So first I put in that white colored pencil, and then I worked around it with a brown, and I softened a part of the catch light because around the edges to the right it gets a little bit blurrier. And then I worked around the eyeball, adding some darker lines, darker values, and of course I will also need to draw some of the darker bits around these lower eyelids, if those are eyelids, and of course this whole area of the slightly longer fur just above the eye, because around the eye we have an area of shorter fur, and then there is a little bit of longer fur that kind of looks like eyebrows here. Anyway, I'm moving on to the forehead area, and I'm just going to block this in here. I'm going to block it in using those colors that I intend to use. So brown, I added a touch of raw umber, which is a duller, more yellowish, lighter brown, and now I'm adding in some darker bits for the shadow areas in the fur. So when I said that I was going to block it in, I meant that I'm going to block it in partially, meaning I'm only going to block in this forehead area. Later I'm going to move on to other areas. And now I'm blending with my finger, just making sure that I push in these colors into these yellowish areas so that I can cover as much of the background color as possible. Sometimes I will not want to cover all of the background color. Sometimes it's a good idea to allow some of the background color to break through. That can also help you achieve some interesting effects and some interesting textures. But here I wanted to have a brown color as the dominant color, with a bit of darker values like black and really dark brown here and there, because those are the shadow areas in the fur. So if you imagine the fur is kind of an uneven surface consisting of a lot of hairs and groups or clumps of hair. Some of those clumps will be sticking out and catching a bit more light from the light source because they're closer to the light source. Other parts of the fur will be tucked in between those clumps of fur, and those will be areas of shadow where I will need a little bit more value, and that's what I'm doing now. I'm trying to designate some of those areas of darker value in between those clumps, and then on top of those lighter bits I'm going to be adding some lighter pencils to create those lighter hairs which are sticking out and make the fur appear even more three-dimensional. For the lighter hairs I'm going to be using a combination of pencils, but my main pencil here will be the cinnamon, which has a bit of a I think a bit of a reddish component to it, and that's okay because when it combines with the browns and some of the other tones underneath, I will actually get the color that I want. Now I wanted to get back to what I said initially about blocking in. Normally when you block in a drawing or a portrait, you block in most of it or all of it. I don't really like to do that. I usually like to work segment by segment, and one of the main reasons for doing that is because it's just easier to focus on one particular segment that way, and also you can minimize smudging that way, because on this surface colored pencils do smudge quite a bit more than on regular paper, because this is a rough textured surface. It grinds down on the pencils, it creates a little bit of residue, and you can move that residue around if you want to blend, so that's a good thing. But it can also work against you if you're not aware of it, and if you don't do what is necessary to minimize the smudging. So because I'm right-handed, I will want to work from top to bottom and from left to right, and I would like to go segment by segment. This is why I didn't block in the entire drawing, because if I did that I would have a very dark mess of dark colors to the right, and I would constantly be dragging my hand over it, and that would make working on the details a bit later much more difficult. On top of those lighter hairs in the forehead area, I also added a touch of light beige, which is even lighter than cinnamon, and that makes the hair appear even more three-dimensional. So the range of value here is extremely important, because it allows you to increase that contrast between those shadow areas in between the clumps of fur and those lighter hairs which are sticking out and catching light from the light source. That makes the fur appear more three-dimensional, and that gives it a lot more depth. So here above the eye we have something like an eyebrow area where again there is a little bit of lighter fur, and these hairs kind of curve slightly from left to right. So I try to imitate the direction of the fur, because whenever you're drawing furry animals and whenever you're trying to draw fur, there are two rules that I always stress are very important if you want to create a realistic looking fur. You want to draw in the direction of the fur, you want to pull your strokes in the direction of the fur, and also you want to pay attention to the length of the fur. So the length of your strokes and the direction of your strokes need to match the length and the direction of the fur. Of course, when you have a complicated looking slightly curly fur like you have here with this bison, you have a little bit more freedom, you can improvise a little bit, but you also need to be aware of the fact that you need to change the direction every now and then, because that'll make it look more realistic. Because if you draw all of the lines in one direction, it actually won't look a lot very much like the bison's fur. I'm moving on to this horn, and I'm going to start with some lighter pencils first and put in some darker pencils later to create shadow areas and to create some textures, because I want to create an appearance of a rough surface of a bone that is scratched and cracked here and there. And the reason why I'm doing it this way is because I've noticed that on textured surfaces like this one, when you work from light to dark, you actually get a lot more texture. The way to produce texture, and you can see that now as I'm dragging this black colored pencil on top of the white, the way to produce texture is to use the darker pencil on top of the lighter one, and then you will have a lot more of this texture that creates this illusion of detail. Some of it will be random, some of it will not be entirely random, because there are some of these marks and scores that I'm trying to create deliberately. But now let's talk a little bit about clear gesso as a surface. So you can see how it's performing by now. I'm pretty happy with the way it did with this subject, because I actually didn't expect to be able to layer so much in terms of layering lighter pencils on top of the darker ones. But you can see that I'm actually able to add some very nice fine details with lighter pencils on top of the darker ones. So this is performing very well. It's not, in my opinion, it's not quite as good as sandpaper. I normally use fine 1000 grit sandpaper, and I don't think it's as good as artist quality sanded papers such as Pastel Matte or UArt. UArt is probably the best. I wouldn't know because I can't really get those papers, but I'm just guessing that it's the closest thing to the fine sandpaper that I normally use. But this also performed very well. Here at the top of the back and behind the neck, I added a little bit more ochre because I want to make a transition here, and I want the fur to become a bit more yellowish. I want some lighter and warmer colors. So a little bit of variety in the color of the fur is a good thing here, because the I've noticed in the reference photos that the fur around the head and the neck area tends to be a little bit darker, but I guess that also depends on the state of the animal's coat, the fur, and the time of the year, and some other factors. And of course it also depends on the lighting, and it depends on the setting, because the fur is going to be reflecting some of the colors in the environment. So here I picked some of the brownish and yellowish tones in addition to the dark brown and black tones. So what was I saying? I was talking about clear gesso and how I was actually able to add these lighter details. You can see how I'm able to put in these lighter marks with a cinnamon colored pencil, and even with this light beige you can see that these lighter marks are showing up on top of the dark brown areas. This is something that you wouldn't be able to do on regular paper. And when I was drawing landscapes on clear gesso, I've done a number of these drawings, my impression was that the ability to layer, especially to put in these smaller, finer details, lighter details on top of the darker layers, my impression was that it would be very limited. But here it actually performed a bit better than I expected. I think the trick is to keep when you want to put in those lighter details, the trick is to keep your pencils fairly sharp, and sometimes you also want to twist your pencil a little bit as you're putting in those lighter details, and that way you can get those very fine lighter marks. So this is a huge advantage of this surface, because on regular paper you would have to find other ways to render this fur, and maybe it wouldn't look quite as realistic, because when you can't put in those lighter details on top of the darker ones, then it's a little bit more difficult for you to create that feeling of depth. It's a little bit more difficult to increase the range of value and to render that realistic looking texture and appearance of the fur. But it's mostly about achieving that feeling of depth, because this way you can feel like this is a long, fluffy, curly hair, and you can almost touch it and feel like some of these larger clumps of fur are sticking out. And that's basically what you want to achieve when you're drawing fur. Now I'm moving on to this lower part of the animal's head and the neck, and here, as you can see, I'm putting down quite a bit more of the black colored pencil. So I want to increase the contrast between the top of the head and the bottom here, because this is the shadow area, it's facing away from the light source, and I want to make this part of the body considerably darker. It's always nice to have those larger contrasts, because that makes the shape of the whole animal easier to understand for the viewer, and it's easier to focus on the lighter details. And also I think these darker bits will stand out nicely against the background. The background so far is yellowish, and I could have just left it this way because I wanted an out of focus bokeh background with very little detail anyway, because the subject is so detailed and the head is so large that I don't really need much in the way of background. But eventually I changed my mind, I have to tell you, and I decided to add some other colors to the background. So here at the top I decided to add a little bit of blue. So I'm not going to make a sharp transition or draw any specific objects in the background. I'm just going to add a touch of blue to the top part of the paper to indicate that there is a sky behind the animal there. Now, of course, this would have been easier if I hadn't already done the top of the head, which looks very detailed, and I have those clumps of fur sticking out. So once I start blending, that's going to be a little bit of a problem, because I'm going to have to push in that blue color everywhere, but that's okay. I'm just going to rework the top of the head because I wanted to make those hairs a bit longer anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I'm just gonna rework them once I push in the blue. At the bottom I'm actually gonna add some brownish and some greenish tones, but first, like I said, I have to finish the top of the head, and I made the hair bend kind of slightly towards the left, like maybe there's a little bit of wind. It doesn't really matter, but just some suggestions of that slight movement of hair. And here at the bottom I made some suggestions of some grassy greenish details, and they're kind of fading into the distance because like I said, I want an out of focus background with virtually no detail. At the bottom I'm going to add a few more touches of that green colored pencil. I think it was the juniper green, because it went well with this yellowish background. And I blended that with my finger because I want to avoid textures and I want to avoid clean edges, because I don't want anything in the background to be distracting, because the main subject is already detailed enough and I want the viewers to be able to focus on it. Now here at the top of the head I decided to add a bit more of the black colored pencil because I felt like this needed to be even darker so that it would stand out against the background. And I did the same thing here at the bottom, making some of the, and even on the left side of the head, making some parts of the fur a little bit darker as needed. I have some more reddish and lighter tones around the snout area, and again I'm using that cinnamon colored pencil here. I'm going to use a little bit of it here at the bottom, but I still want this lower part of the fur around the neck to remain much darker, but I can still introduce a few lighter details here and there. I don't think it'll be too distracting. Sometimes actually there are benefits to simplifying the shadow areas, because it allows you to focus on these lighter areas a bit more. So sometimes you don't want to burden the shadow areas with too much detail. Here I'm actually going to add a little bit of detail, but I'm not going to create too much contrast, and I'm going to try not to make it too distracting. I'm also going back and forth and reworking some of the areas I've already done, because you want to create an overall balance in terms of colors and the texture of the fur, the appearance of the fur. Not that I would know how exactly the fur of this animal looks, but I'm doing the best I can based on the reference photos that I saw. Here at the bottom I use my Tombow Mono Zero eraser to erase some longer marks that kind of look like longer blades of grass here, because I made the background a bit darker using those brownish and greenish tones. So now that I'm using my eraser on top of it, some of these lighter marks are showing up. The only problem is that my camera isn't adjusted that well, but I think you can still see what I'm doing. I pulled some lighter marks at the bottom to create some indications of lighter blades of grass, and that's about all the detail that I want to create in the background. I'm not going to make it any more detailed than that, because I think it's enough for the viewer to understand the setting, to understand where the scene takes place. Now I'm adding some brownish tones on top of these darker shadow areas. And once I finish that, I'm going to be wrapping things up, because I still haven't done the ear. And the ear is barely visible because it's surrounded with a lot of long fur. Actually, in some reference photos you can see that you can barely see the ears because the fur is so long. I picked one where I could actually see a little bit of the ear. and I'm just going to draw a little bit more shadow around it, because it's going to be casting a bit of shadow downwards, and then I'm going to cover the rest of it with a brown colored pencil. But around the very edge of the ear, again, we're going to have a little bit of a lighter value. So I'm going to put in some ivory colored pencil first around the edge, because I really want that edge of the ear to stand out, and then I'm going to work on top of that with some light beige and some brownish tones. But the main idea is to make the ear stand out. That's why I need that range of value, and that's why I need that contrast between the tip of the ear and the darker background. Now I have to tell you that when it comes to materials, in addition to the Faber-Castell black colored pencil, I also use the Kohinoor silky black pencils, which are, in my experience, a little bit darker, and they're a little bit easier to layer on top of the lighter details if I want to create some really dark pitch black areas. So I'm going back in, trying to increase the depth of the fur here and there, adding some darker details or some lighter details as needed, and I still need to do a little bit of work on this ear. So like I said, I just wanted to test this surface using a clear gesso, and I wanted to test it by drawing a slightly more detailed subject. This is a little bit larger than some of the other drawings I've done. The head is huge, and obviously it has a lot of detail, mostly on the fur. And the surface performed well enough because I was able to layer, and I was able to put in lighter details on top of the darker ones with ease. I'm wrapping things up here, putting down some finishing touches, because the drawing is almost done. So once again, for those of you who didn't catch the materials I used Faber-Castell Polychromos color pencils. You can use any pencils, but the surface I think is more important, because I used a tone paper primed with some clear gesso, which created a more textured surface and allowed me to add in more details. So I'm just finishing these corners where the paper was secured with some tape, and once that is done, I'm going to be finishing the drawing. This is what it looks like. I would like to remind you to give me a like and subscribe, and also don't forget to check out my other videos. If you want to see longer videos and more content, you should check out my Patreon. That would be all for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.